Police violence transforms protests over tax reforms into a mass movement calling for social change. Pandemic-weary Colombians take their descent to the streets, and as their numbers grow, so does their list of grievances. Can President Iván Duque put out a fire that's been smoldering for decades? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Colombia's anti-government protests. Now, despite being recalled just 4 days after they were announced, President Iván Duque's tax reforms have unleashed Colombia's largest wave of social unrest in decades. Citizens armed only with umbrellas and garbage cans to shield themselves against bullets and tear gas have also fallen victim to arbitrary detentions, torture, and disappearances, according to Human Rights Watch. Protesters are now demanding better health care, basic income, and education, as well as an end to police brutality. And that's a demand the country's peace commissioner has rejected. All this is taking place as a third wave of COVID-19 sweeps across Colombia, leaving millions out of work and compounding years of anger at a government seen by many as corrupt, incompetent, and out of touch. The movement, now entering its fourth week, shows no sign of slowing down. Here's Natalie Pohonen.
Scenes like this have been repeated across Colombia for weeks. These protests started in April as a pushback against a tax reform plan. They've morphed into demonstrations against growing inequality, poverty, and corruption. There's no sign that this anger towards President Iván Duque's government will end soon. For many Colombians, the now shelved tax proposal was an indication of just how out of touch the government is with the people it's supposed to govern. Like its neighbors, the country has endured health and economic crises exacerbated by the pandemic. Colombia has Latin America's third highest death toll from COVID-19. Unemployment has soared to more than 16%, and 42.5% of the population are now living in poverty. The government framed the tax overhaul as a way of bolstering the nation's finances. It would have meant tax rises, and that's something protesters say they simply couldn't afford after the year everyone has just endured. The protests were peaceful to start off with. Security forces responded with a crackdown. Police have been accused of using excessive force with deadly consequences. At least 42 people have been killed in protests and clashes with police. All bar one were civilians. The unrest has opened up deep social divisions.
Many people here were called guerrilla combatants or paramilitaries. There is no such thing. Here, there are students who got tired and are young.
What's needed is that they, the government, listen to the people, that they listen to young people. We're tired of the same old politicians.
The number of demonstrators has grown, and so has their list of demands. They now include ending police violence, protections for indigenous people, and health reform. There's frustration too with how the government has implemented the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC rebel group that ushered an end to decades of conflict. In parts of the country, protest action means blockading highways. Not everyone supports these moves, but some of those directly affected can understand them.
We're in a bad situation. Many tolls, very expensive fuel, very cheap shipping. We're doing what we can to half survive, and the government does not want to have a dialogue.
The government has held talks with some protest group leaders to try to bring an end to the demonstrations. But there are no quick fixes for many of these complex social issues, because they've been simmering for decades. Duque will end his presidential term next year. The challenge for both the outgoing government and its successor will be how to address these fault lines before they divide Colombia even further. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Okay, let's get straight to our panel for a closer look at what is happening in Colombia. All of my guests are in the capital, Bogota. Starting with Paloma Valencia, a lawyer and senior senator representing the ruling Democratic Center Party, the party of President Ivan Duque. Ana Maria Rodriguez is a human rights attorney and the deputy director of the Colombian Commission of Jurists. And finally, we have Sergio Guzman. He is the director and co-founder of the Colombia Risk Analysis Group. Thank you all so much for being with us. Let's start with establishing what your feelings are toward these protests and the protesters. How justified have they been in taking the action they've taken, and how justified are the police in responding as they have? Let me begin with Sergio.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with the senator and with you, Andrea, and with you as well. I think the problem is that we are at a lacking of understanding of what the country situation is. The government is holding its ground, particularly on what its narrative should be. And the protesters have a long list of grievances, which, as the report showed, remain unaddressed. And I think that at the moment, there's very little trust in the dialogue that the government is trying to do, because in 2019, the government tried to dialogue with different groups of protesters, and that led to nowhere. And partly the COVID pandemic, when it started, it just worsened many of the problems that were underlying and made those fault lines that you mentioned even worse.
Okay. Ana Maria Rodriguez, are you on the same page there? And please do include what you make of the police response to the protests.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning. Well, I think that there's a huge lack of empathy from the government towards the population. The decision to answer to the protests with repression, with violent repression, instead of starting open spaces for dialogue and for listening to what the population is requesting, shows this lack of empathy. So people are actually asking for things they have been asking for over 2 years, and there has been no answer. So that's why they have come out to the streets to strike and to demand the guarantee of their basic needs, and also some other things. But unfortunately, the answer has been violent. Police has undoubtedly been abusing of the use of force, and the answer to that level of violence is, again, the use of more violence, asking for the military forces to come out to the streets and try to also support the control of the strikers.
Okay, Paloma Valencia, I need your take on that. And it's interesting as well, because you, of course, in part represent the government that was elected in large part because they take a tougher stance on disobedience and crime. So I believe you think that the police response to these protesters is very much justified.
Thank you, Andrea. I want to say hello to everybody, but I think you're showing only one side of the coin, because Colombia has been in this protest, but of course, there is a lot to show in the way we all want a better country. We all want to get out of poverty and to grow economically so we can have more employment, of course. But this strike has been the absolute opposite of that. We have blocked streets and highways that are taking down every small business, every medium business, every large business. We have seen how many animals, saying chickens and pigs, had died because they were not able to receive food. And we also have seen all the transport sector being basically given to nothing because they cannot move. They have been violence from the protesters in many places in Colombia. You could say we have been seeing a kidnap from many cities in neighborhoods where the people were blocked. They were not able to go out of their houses. They were not able to buy food. There was scarcity of food, of gasoline. There was a scarcity even of potable water. So you're showing only one side of what's happening. Of course, Colombia needs to grow economically so we can make up all the poverty and the problems we have with this pandemic. But the strike is going the other side. They're trying to keep Colombia into poverty and turning down everything that the activity of the economy was beginning to show. So I will say the government may have a lot of mistakes, and of course you can criticize President Duque as much as you want, but you should respect the rights of all the civilians who are not in strike and they want to work and they want their business to go alive and they want to generate the economy to be alive again. Okay. This strike is costing a lot to the country.
Ana Maria, let me ask you then, I mean, this is a perennial problem around the world in that there is the frustration of societies that have massive inequalities that are very evident, unfortunately, in Colombia. Eventually, people do take to the streets and their frustration explodes. And many times their valid grievances become completely shrouded in the acts of a few who do act irresponsibly, who attack businesses, attack police, start riots. For example, do you fear that's what's happening now in Bogota, that decades of valid grievances are now being masked by what is just chaos, in part, on the streets of the country?
Most of the protests and most of the people coming out to the streets to strike are peaceful protesters, justified by, as you were saying, long time conflicts going on. And of course, there has been small groups of people not part of these peaceful protests that have actually committed excesses, that have committed some acts of vandalism against small businesses and other types of infrastructure. But it's a very small group. It's not the main, the most of the people taking part of the protest. And nevertheless, the violent answer has been against all these people that are protesting. I mean, there is not a directed and targeted answer to stop those committing the excesses and the abuses and the acts of vandalism. The police brutality has been, and you have all seen videos and pictures from around the country, that this abuse in the use of force has been committed generally against all the people protesting. Even this violence has been committed against people that has not been taking part of the protests. So it's an excess, it's an abuse, and it is shown by the government and by the authorities, and in many cases by some of the media, as a generalized situation of chaos and of vandalism that somehow justifies this level of violence, which is something we do not agree. Because what is actually happening is that the police is violating the human rights of peaceful protesters.
Sergio, if I can come to you, I want to ask about something I feel is very important. I want to talk about actual Colombian society with you, because there's an issue I think needs to be addressed, which can't be measured in statistics or in studies, and it's more about an attitude. It's how the poor are seen and treated by Colombia's upper class. How much do wealthy Colombians have a problem with perhaps entitlement and indifference to the poor? How much do they arguably want things to stay the same in order to ensure that they have a lifestyle that they're very accustomed to with servicio, i.e. cheap maid services, drivers, servants, etc., so that they don't feel the need for change that a majority of Colombians are rallying for right now?
Andrea, thank you very much. I think the major crevice of class divide in Colombia is something that we're not yet grappling with. We have also structural racism against Afro-Colombians, against indigenous people that has gone on for centuries. And so these class divides have been made worse by the pandemic. We already had a highly unequal society, second in Latin America only to Brazil. COVID has made unemployment particularly bad, coming from a low 9% to a peak of 21% last year. At the same time, inequality levels have gone up in cities like Cali, in cities like Bogota, in cities like Medellin. And many people who work in the informal sector couldn't stay in their homes with their laptops working remotely, but had to go out of their homes to earn a living. And I think that that was one of the things that provoked a lot of unrest at the current situation. It really upset people that these inequalities were much more surfaced much more during the pandemic. And now with the vaccination strategy, we're seeing something else, which is that the majority of well-to-do Colombians already went to Miami, already went to New York, already went to Texas to get their vaccinations. And ordinary Colombians have to wait, perhaps for months, to get their vaccinations while their relatives suffer from COVID and while they die, and while they suffer from the effects of unemployment. So yes, absolutely, our class divide is something that the pandemic has surfaced, is something that we have not dealt with, and the tax reform did not address either. Although there were some subsidies awarded to the majority of low-income populations, the question of who paid for those subsidies was important. Whereas the government said that the tax contributors should be expanded, tax base should be expanded, a lot of other people believe that the well-to-do and corporations should shoulder a higher cost.
Right. Paloma, you may have been distracted, I noticed on camera, but if you want to respond to what you heard Sergio say, please do. And I also want to include the fact that during Colombia's economic miracle time around 2010, 2011, was an opportunity lost to invest in the poor, to address that kind of indifference and, to raise their standard of living via mass investment in education and potential for upward mobility. FDI was hitting record highs back then, but little of it seemed to have actually served to change the standard of living for a huge proportion of Colombians.
Andrea, the issue here is nobody wants to be a poor country. Of course, it's better to be a rich country, but it isn't a choice. It's the way you have run the country for many years, in the way you build this richness. So I will say, of course, you should think about making a lot for the poor, and Colombia has been doing it. That's why we have figures that show that much more than 1.5 million of Colombians didn't went into poverty because of the politics of the government. But we didn't have enough money. Colombia have a very small budget if you see it compared with many other countries. 1/3, it goes for the international debt and the Colombian debt. 1/3 goes to pensions, because we have a lot of pensions that the government has to pay. We're talking about the armed forces, and we're talking the big bag is the pensions from all the features of the public system. And the other third part of the budget goes to run the government and to invest in the poor people. The government made an effort during the pandemic to go into 2.8 million of homes in Colombia. So they have a third of a minimum salary, and they were paid this for 1 year now, and we're extending it for so many years. The tax reform was looking to have more money and to make bigger into 5 million this program. We also made a program that was saying to the small businesses and the medium businesses that were dying during the pandemic that the government will pay 40% of the salary of the poor people so they won't get fired. This was 3.2 million of Colombian homes. So the government has been making a lot of efforts, but of course you need more money. And where are you going to get money if you don't have the reform.
Okay. Ana Maria, I need to put that to you then. I mean, the OECD also talked about Colombia's economic miracle, but clearly stated the growth was not inclusive enough. But we're hearing from the senator there that the government really did the best it could and can do under the circumstances of what is effectively a developing country. Is that good enough?
Well, I think actually you can check that Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. And the distance between the wealthiest people and the poorest people is very, very big. Actually, during the pandemic, most of the support and most of the measures taken by the government were trying to attend banks, businesses, and the wealthiest sectors of our society, and the poorest people didn't get enough help to go through the pandemic. Our health system is actually not strong enough, and hunger was one of the main issues during the last year in our country. So, of course, people are not willing to pay more taxes, are not willing to pay for a health reform when they are having trouble to live daily. The levels of poverty in the last year increased in Colombia in a scaring way. And that's why people are coming out to the streets. They are done waiting for equal distribution of the Colombian richness. And it's not enough what is being done now.
Okay, Sergio, we're down to our last 3 minutes. I'd like to get another comment from you and as well as Paloma. Please tell me, if you can, how you think this is actually supposed to end. And if it doesn't end, will it spread beyond Colombia's borders and into wider Latin America?
Well, I think there's definitely a sense that without dialogue, without trust in the counterpart, we can get nowhere. The government has unilaterally made some measures to give poor students and youths some advantages, giving no credit to the protesters for these measures. And protesters at the same time have tried to take control of ports and try to blockade the country, giving the government very little option in some regards, but to use force to ensure mobility. So these are problematic issues in and of themselves. Without international mediation, for instance, it's going to be very difficult for the protesters and the government to be able to reach consensus, because this government has tried in the past to dialogue with protesters to no avail, partly because there's really no spirit of trust and collaboration. I welcome the tone that Senator Paloma is bringing to the table, because that's certainly a departure from the government's approach to protesters in the past, calling them vandals, calling them terrorists, calling them insurgents, calling them financed by Venezuela and by other external actors. So if the government is able to tone down the rhetoric, stop victimizing and stop stigmatizing many of the protests, it can build on a narrative that is positive, that goes in the direction that Senator Valencia was saying, which is to build a better country, which is to build a more prosperous society. However, other Latin American countries are taking note as well.
Okay, yeah. Senator Paloma, is the government ready for that dialogue that Sergio was speaking of? And does it want that kind of interaction with protesters to speak as equals?
Of course, Andrea, the government always wants to talk. But the thing is, it's very difficult to dialogue with a strike, because who's the boss? So every time the government talks with someone, everybody says, no, that's not the one who represents us. And they say, we want that, and the other says, we want the other thing. So it's very difficult. So that's why you have democracy. So you win elections and you make choices for what you're going to do. What I think is that you may strike as much as you want, but you are not in the right to turn down every business in this country.
Paloma Valencia, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Our economy.
Okay, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Very unfortunately, we're out of time. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate it. And thanks, of course, to our viewers for being with us. See you next time.